story is I looked at the arguments and they just weren't there for God's existence. And so to combat the notion that atheists are just emotional and just don't have any evidence in their favor, instead one should be prepared to present, here's why I don't believe in the first cause argument or Pascal's Wager or, some of the more basic ones.
Yeah, I think Pascal's Wager is probably my least favorite theistic argument of all of them. I mean, because right off the bat, I can think of three arguments that say, no, this doesn't work. But you try to explain that, and it's a little bit of a different story.
Well, one of the things that I love about teaching Introduction to Philosophy, and I also, by the way, teach a world religions course, and we go through some of the major religions of the world and so forth. But in Introduction to Philosophy, when I present not just religious arguments, but arguments of all different types about mind and free will and so forth, I always try to give them a good presentation. So when I'm presenting the argument about, Pascal's Wager or some sort of first cause argument, like where did everything come from? It must have an origin. It must be God and so forth. I try to sell it to the students and say, look, here's what they say, and I present it as powerfully as possible. And then, I pause for a minute, take questions, and then proceed to destroy it, and so forth, because that's my job. Okay. And so Pascal's Wager, when you first hear of it, it actually sounds like a fair argument. It seems like, this makes a lot of sense, because Pascal is saying, look, if you believe in God and you die, then you might get a reward. If you don't believe in God and you die, then you have no chance for a reward.
Exactly.
So if you have a choice between, you might win or you definitely won't win, you might as well take a chance, because as Pascal would say, belief is free. You can start believing right now. It doesn't cost you anything. Mm-hmm. So it's like if someone were to come up and say, hey, why don't you play the lottery? You might not win, but the ticket is free. Well, you'd be a fool to turn it down. Okay, let me just go ahead and try it, right? And it sounds pretty good until you start looking at some of the difficulties with this argument, not the least of which is that, well, I don't know, do you want me to go through some of
the go ahead.
things? Okay. One of my favorite objections to Pascal's Wager is, well, by the way, let me give you an analogy. I love this analogy that I made up, okay? Suppose that someone were to tell you, you know what, in a few minutes somebody is going to come here into this room, a group of large, muscular, martial arts expert bodybuilders are going to come in here and grab you, and there's nothing you can do about it, and they're going to take you to another room that is made of metal. It's 100% metal. The walls, the floor, ceiling, everything's made of metal. They're going to throw you in this room, and they're going to pull a switch, and it's going to send thousands of volts of electricity through this room, and if you're in that room, you're going to die. However, someone says, before they pull the switch, you should know there's going to be 4 chairs in that room. A green one, a red one, a yellow one, and a blue one. If you sit in the red chair, I can't guarantee you'll survive, but I've heard that chair is insulated, and that can save you. So since you've got to be in the room, you may as well sit in the red chair. You're going to be there anyway. You may as well sit. It's like, well, you're going to die anyway. You might as well take a chance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Until, let's say, somebody starts dragging you into the room, and one of the people dragging you says, hey, let me give you a tip. Sit in the green chair. The red chair does nothing. And then another one says, hey, I'm a yellow chair man. You got to sit in the yellow chair. And then another one says, I've been in that room. There are no chairs. And so forth. Well, then what do you do?
Exactly.
Okay. Pascal's Wager is asking you to take a chance. But how do you know how to win this game? It's a wager. I mean, the analogy is with a game. So it's as if someone is trying to tell you how you win the game, but they don't know the rules. Okay.
That's a good one.
That's impossible. They can't tell you how to win if they don't know the rules of the game. And Pascal says, look, Pascal surveyed all of the arguments for God's existence that were around in his day. They're pretty much the ones we have today. He didn't think any of those worked. He said, look, reason can't tell you the answer. Reason can't tell you whether God exists. So we've got this, basically, he didn't call it a wager, but it's been called a wager. But yeah, you don't know the rules. You can't prove that anybody's going to reward you. And then also, he lived in a much less multiculturally aware age. Now, if someone says, "Hey, you should believe in God," okay, I'll believe in Allah. Oh wait, not that one. Hey, hold on a second. You said to believe in God. Which one is going to get me the reward? Well, you don't know. What if you go up to, let's say, what if Pascal died, and he shows up there at the gates of heaven, the pearly gates, but they don't look so pearly. They look kind of Mayan. He walks in, and then some being with a bird's head comes up and says, "I'm God. Did you believe in me?" Well, what's he going to say? Is there someone else I can talk to? Is there?
Exactly.
Are you the only one here? Right. He doesn't know the rules of the game. He doesn't know how it's played. He sure can't tell you how to win. And what if God is the kind of being that says, "You know what? Okay, maybe you didn't know about me. I'm some old Sumerian god whose name has been forgotten. I don't care if you didn't believe in me, as long as you didn't believe in some false god."
The Homer Simpson defense.
There we go. So, yeah, you don't want to get God mad. Plus, by the way, one of the best things that I think is a rebuttal to Pascal's Wager is truth matters. If you're going to believe something just because it sounds good and because you might win a game, well, you know what? Then you're saying, I'm not going to believe something based on whether or not it's true or likely to be true. And once you start down that road, I think, well, then if truth is out the window, you're going to be very gullible and anything goes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other two arguments that I remember. That one was one that comes to mind right off the top of my head. But two other ones are, one is that even if this particular God exists and he's going to use this fear tactic to get you to worship him, that's not a God that loves you. So why do you need to love him in return? Because it's more of an abusive relationship. It's like the battered spouse, love me or else kind of thing. That was another argument that I heard. And then the third one is that, even if, well, I can't even remember, I can't even think I can voice the third one because it's been a while since I've used it. But there was the one that, what if you've got the wrong one? What if you've got the wrong God? What if he gets angry at you because you're worshiping a different God? Right,
exactly. And I think that those are all very good objections. So it starts out as looking like it sounds like a pretty reasonable argument. It actually doesn't really hold much water. I think it's a very poor argument in general.
Well, what are some of your favorite arguments for God that you've heard over the years?
For God?
Yeah, some of your favorite apologetics that you've heard that you think would be the hardest to refute. I mean, I know it boils down to like maybe 5 or 6.
Yeah, well, actually, I think one of the main problems with lots of arguments for God's existence, and I would say maybe the majority of them that are in common use, is that their conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. In other words, let's take, for example, the first cause argument that goes back all the way to Aristotle and probably was old even then. But it's the basic idea that, things don't come from nothing. Everything has to come from somewhere. So, therefore, the universe came from somewhere, namely God, therefore God exists. Okay, well, here's the problem. Even if, and ignoring the fact that, apparently not everything came from somewhere if God didn't come from anywhere. But it sort of refutes itself. But
right.
But even if the universe came from somewhere, it doesn't follow that it came from God. It doesn't follow that it came from a living being. It doesn't follow that it came from a being that's all-knowing and all-powerful and so forth. So even if the universe had an origin, that something made it, it doesn't follow that that thing was alive or conscious or that it still exists. That the conclusion just plain doesn't follow logically. It's a argument that is invalid in that sense. So, or certainly unsound at least. And I think the Kalam argument, which is a very similar one.
I think that's William Lane Craig's favorite go-to.
Yeah, that's the one that goes back to some Arabic scholars. That one is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, namely God. that also has the same problem, right? Even if the universe began to exist, it doesn't follow that it came from something alive. In other words, you can't get God out of that.
Right.
And most of the arguments for God's existence fall in that same category. They just plain don't work logically. So I don't really have a whole lot of respect for the vast majority of arguments for God's existence. I think probably the one that I think is the best of the bad lot, I mean, I think the whole lot is bad, but probably the best is the argument from religious experience, where someone says, look, I had an experience. It is best explained by my having a direct knowledge or contact with some sort of otherworldly, other dimensional or mystical supernatural being.
Right.
Therefore, such a being exists.
Yeah.
Okay. That's probably the best I can think of, but I still don't think that one comes anywhere close to demonstrating its conclusion. Primarily because there are lots of instances where we think that we perceive something and we just plain don't.
Mm-hmm.
Someone being convinced of the truth of something is no guarantee that that thing is actually true. And we can go to any mental institution and see people that are convinced of all kinds of things that we wholeheartedly reject. Why should we believe someone who says that they had an experience of something when we have no independent verification of that thing?
Right.
And especially in the light of, there's a Dr. Persinger at Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada. He invented, he's a brain researcher, and he looked at certain types of brain activity in a particular part of the brain, and he postulated that if one were to stimulate that part of the brain, that it would result in a religious experience. And so he built, believe it or not, he built a helmet.
Is it the God helmet?
Yes, the God helmet. And by the use of magnetic waves, that way you don't have to use surgery, he stimulates that part of the brain, and sure enough, it does produce religious experiences on demand. Okay, so if we then now have a physical explanation for these experiences, I think that's a better explanation than saying that these experiences are veridical, or in other words, that they are accurately presenting some supernatural being.
There was another one that I liked that where they had used something similar to the God helmet, but what they did was they hit. I want to say it was the hypothalamus, but it's the center of the brain that acts as basically the neural hub. It acts like basically a giant router for your brain. And they hit that with an electromagnetic pulse that disrupted the signals. And when they did that, the person, their eyes were open, but they completely blanked. There was no longer any kind of thought. There was no when they stopped it, the person didn't even realize that something had happened. It was just picked up where they left off. That their entire consciousness basically shut down just as soon as that was stimulated. So that kind of shows me, at least, that what we think of as our consciousness of ourself, it's kind of like how Steven Pinker puts it, the mind is something that the brain does, just like blood flow is what the heart does. And so it's not necessarily that there's something beyond that animating us outside of our brain. That's basically it.
Right. I think the notion that somehow our consciousness is non-physical has just been entirely rebutted by science in the last 100 years, especially in the last 50 years, where we can do kinds of brain research and experiments that were impossible a century ago. And we know without any kind of doubt that our thoughts are the direct result of things going on in our brains. There's a Professor Jose Delgado, I think, of Yale, who did experiments on people in surgery where he'd poke a certain part of the brain. I think it was Delgado, and he people would hear things or smell things or so and so on that weren't there. And so this pretty much shows us that our perceptions are physically based. So the notion that we can survive death, that is something that is completely untenable in the modern age.
Yeah, but people still tend to hold on to that. I think, and part of it may be just that as human beings, our brains just are not able to comprehend a world without them, without us. And so that's why we have this idea of an afterlife.